I am Manuela Tomei. I'm the Director of the Conditions of Work and Equality Department here in the ILO. And I'm very excited to have the honor of introducing and concluding this webinar. I will very soon introduce you the distinguished panelists with whom we will entertain the conversation today. But before doing so, I will make a number of important announcements of a logistical nature. First, interpretation is available in English, French, and Spanish. And those of you who have joined the webinar through the Zoom application can select the language you prefer, pressing on the bottom with the global icon. Please mute the original audio. For matters of accessibility, interpretation in international sign language and live captioning in English are also provided. For technical audio reasons, all participants' microphones and video will be muted, and the audience is welcome to share their thoughts and submit any questions in the chat box during the event. For the panelists, you will be asked to activate your video when you will be taking the floor and deactivate it when you are not speaking. The second important announcement is that just right now we are going to show a short video on Convention 190 that will set the context for today's webinar, after which we will move to the panelists. Thank you. So the International Labour Conference of the ILO adopted Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 1 year ago. And 1 year later, the world is struggling with the crisis of unprecedented scale, which has been produced by COVID-19. This crisis is having a devastating impact on people's health and lives, on jobs and enterprises. The related anxiety, fears, and uncertainties have often been accompanied by an increase in violence and harassment in the world of work and elsewhere. I think that we can confidently say today that Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 could have not been more relevant and timely. 1 year since its adoption, we count on almost 2 ratifications. Last week, Uruguay deposited the instrument of ratification with the ILO, becoming the first country to have ratified it. We also have learned that the instrument of ratification of Fiji has just reached Geneva and will soon be deposited with the ILO through an official ceremony, making Fiji the first Asian Pacific country to ratify the convention. This means that the convention will enter into force 1 year after the deposit of the instrument of ratification of Fiji. Today's webinar is an opportunity to mark the anniversary of Convention 190 and to reflect on its relevance in the context of COVID-19, while also promoting its ratification and calling for action to leverage the instrument as a framework to build back a better world of work, free from violence and harassment. This webinar will also be an opportunity to hear about the challenges and lessons that countries that have ratified the convention have faced, and those that plan to do so are facing, and to learn also how the ILO and its constituents, including the social partners, can support sustained progress to a world of work where respect and dignity will become the norm. So let me now introduce you, the speakers of today. I will just mention their names and titles. Their CVs are available online, and I hope that the panelists will not mind, but I do this in the interest of time. On my left, Guy Ryder, the Director-General of the ILO. Mary Clark Walker, the Secretary-Treasurer of the Canadian Labour Congress, who was also the spokesperson for the workers during the 2 years of negotiations that culminated with the adoption of the convention and the recommendation. She will stay with us until 3:30 only. And afterwards, Rose Omamo, who is the General Secretary of the Amalgamated Union of Kenya Metal Workers, will step in. I have also the pleasure of introduce Gabriela Herzog, who is the Vice President of the Corporate Responsibility and Labor Affairs of United States Council for International Business. She was also a very active and influential member of the employers group that took part in the shaping of the two instruments. Colin E. Jordan, the Minister of Labor and Social Partnership Relations for Barbados, who also played a very important role during the negotiations of the two instruments, will be accompanying us through a video message. Unfortunately, he had another competing commitment. We also count on the participation of Gerardo Cedrola, the advisor to the Minister of Labor and Social Security from Uruguay. And again, thank you very much to Uruguay for being the first in showing the way to ratification. And last but not least, Vicky Ehrenstein Toivo, Special Advisor to the Ministry of Labor, Industrial Relations and Employment Creation of Namibia, who was also a very active and vocal government representative, speaking often on behalf of the African group. The discussion will be moderated by Shona Olney, Chief of Gender Equality and Diversity branch of the ILO. Shona, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Manuela. And just to say how much I share your excitement about the event today. This is really an exciting moment, I think, for all of us. And thanks all of you for joining us virtually. We have numbers that far exceeded our expectations. And it's very important that together we can mark this first anniversary of the adoption of Convention number 190 and recommendation number 206. These are truly key instruments to bring us closer to ending violence and harassment in the world of work, including in the COVID-19 context. We'll dedicate the next hour to a panel discussion, and afterwards we'll open the floor for questions and answers. If you have a question, feel free to submit it in the chat box if you're following us in Zoom, or in the comment box if you're with us on YouTube. But before we start with our panelists, we're going to launch a poll, which you should all see on your screens right now. There it is. What made you join this webinar today? So pick one of the choices there. And while that's going on, we'll move to our first question. And the first question I'd like to address to the ILO Director-General to set the scene for today's event. 1 year ago, Convention number 190 was adopted, and we also had the conclusion of the ILO Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work. And both of these came out of last year's International Labour Conference a year ago, almost a year ago today. The Convention and the Declaration were negotiated prior to the COVID-19 crisis but the issues they address are proving to be more relevant than ever, while the world is responding to, and in some cases now recovering from, the COVID-19 pandemic. In your view, Director-General, how can Convention number 190 and the Centenary Declaration support the building back of what you've called a better normal?
Well, thank you very much, Shauna. Let me greet everybody, fellow panelists, and the encouraging and impressive number of colleagues joining us from around the world. Greetings to everybody. Shauna, you've asked absolutely critically important questions, and I'm going to have to be very telegraphic in what I say about this. It was remarkable, wasn't it? 1 year ago, in some ways it seems like an eternity ago, many of you were in Geneva, and we adopted one after the other two extraordinarily important instruments, the Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work, and then, of course, Convention 190. Now, behind the Centenary Declaration was this idea that we were living in a world of work that was being transformed at a pace and with a profundity that we'd never seen before, and that we had to react to that and work out what we needed to do to make sure that the ILO's mandate of social justice was made a reality in these transformative conditions. And I think the Centenary Declaration did an extraordinary job in setting out a roadmap, a path for a human-centered future of work with investment in people, investment in institutions of work, investment in the jobs of the future. And what lay behind all of this was the notion, and it's confirmed by all of the history of the ILO and the work that governments, employers, and workers have done over a century, is that the future is not decided for us. It is up to us to create that future. We have choices, we have alternatives, and we have to make sure we make the right ones, the ones that promote social justice. And I think that the Centenary Declaration did a remarkable job in that regard. And then, just 6 months after the adoption of that declaration, COVID-19 hit us, and the world changed utterly, almost overnight, and the world of work has been devastated. From all the different countries that are taking part in this webinar, we know that jobs have been destroyed, livelihoods turned upside down, and we're not out of it yet. But here's the key message. Rather than being rendered obsolete or overtaken by these dramatic events, what I think the pandemic has done is to confirm that the task and the guidance that the Centenary Declaration gives us is absolutely more necessary than ever. We're all agreed, I think, that we have to build back better from the catastrophe that's hit the world of work. And in that regard, the Declaration is a sort of a guiding star, along, I would say, with the United Nations 2030 agenda. So that's why we have made the Declaration the centerpiece of the ILO's activities in the years to come. So that's one part of my answer, Shauna. But what about Convention 190? What about the specific role and importance of Convention 190? Well, I'm going to be listening to people in a moment who can say a lot more about Convention 190 than I can. But what have we seen in these conditions of pandemic? Well, regrettably, but undeniably, we've seen a growth. We've seen a spike in acts of violence and harassment in the world of work. They've always been there. They haven't always been recognized in the way that they should, but they've always been with us. And now the pandemic has really pushed them upwards rather than downwards. What have we seen? In conditions of lockdown and confinement, we're hearing from all reliable sources of information an increase, a spike in domestic violence, particularly violence against women. Frontline workers, those people who are doing essential tasks to get us through this pandemic, are being subjected to extraordinary acts of intimidation, violence, and harassment. Those, that least of all should be subjected to that type of thing. And also, as many of us have resorted to teleworking under conditions of the pandemic, those, I'm going to say, opportunities, those possibilities for cyberbullying, which we're contemplated in Convention 190, they're coming out too. I mean, it shows that Convention 190 was a very smart instrument. We saw a lot of things coming down the road, and they've happened. So what can I say about this? It means that creating a future of work which is free of all forms of violence and harassment It's the most basic, it's the most, minimum requirement that we have to build the future of work that we want. If we're not able to provide everybody with conditions free of violence and harassment at work, we will have failed from the outset in our tasks of building the better future of work that we want. So my last word is, this terrible pandemic has underlined in the most dramatic way just how important the Declaration and Convention 190 are. Done nothing to render them yesterday's news, obsolete in any way, quite the reverse. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what other colleagues have to say on these matters. Thanks, Shauna.
Thank you so much, Director General. And I think it's really important to what you've highlighted about the forward-looking nature of the Declaration and of Convention number 190. And this can be said for many other ILO instruments. They really are often ahead of their time, and they withstand the test of time. And certainly these instruments are already proving to be very, very important and very adaptable to the changing nature of work. Now I'd like to move to Ms. Clark-Walker and Ms. Herzog. You were both very much involved in the discussions that led to the historic adoption of Convention number 190. Now, as we've heard from the Director General, we see that the risk of violence and harassment is even higher during times of crises. And we've seen this in the COVID context. We've seen the news reports, we've seen the attacks on the frontline workers. Now, however, last year when we were all in discussions about this instrument, no one would have expected that we would be facing a pandemic and its fallout today. So in your view, what role can Convention number 190 play in the context of the COVID-19 response and recovery? And Ms. Clark-Walker, I'm going to start with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shauna, and happy anniversary to everyone. At the end of the first year of negotiations, in an effort to get a strong document, I don't know if people remember, but I remember telling everyone to spend some time putting themselves in other people's shoes, to take some time to just know what that is. And it was something that my mother and my grandmother drilled into my head, because they both would say, you never know when you may be in the same or similar situation, so always treat people the way that you want to be treated. And so I can guarantee that when we were having those negotiations last year and the year before, nobody thought that we would be heading into a situation that we currently are in now, a situation that puts us directly in the shoes of some of the same women, the same workers whose stories that we shared in negotiations. And yet, as the directors already said, here we are. COVID has definitely exposed and exacerbated a lot of the dynamics that were raised during negotiations. The sectors more likely to risk exposure to violence and harassment are right now our frontline sectors, those who are underpaid, undervalued, those who work in precarious situations so that we can eat and enjoy the luxuries that we have, those whom you wouldn't even give a second look to, the young woman cleaning your office, the letter carrier or the truck driver delivering food that your cafeteria, your supermarket, or your corner store needs. The ones who are now deemed essential, and the folks who have no choice but to work, the care workers, the workers who are caring for the sick, the disabled, the elderly, our children, those who are in the retail and service sector, people who work with the public, the informal sector, all areas where you'll find women and groups in situations of vulnerability, and all areas where we're seeing an increase in violence and harassment during COVID. C190 acknowledges that there's a gender dynamic to violence and harassment, and it also acknowledges the disproportionate impact on women, those in the informal sector, and people who are in one or more of those groups of vulnerability, and further recognizes the need for a gender-responsive approach. I think that the gender-responsive approach also will deal with some of the underlying causes and risk factors that we see. And with many working from home, and this has already been mentioned as well, it means that it's not just domestic workers, home-based workers, or teleworkers who are experiencing the increased risk of violence and harassment when the workplace is a private place. Domestic violence is also on the increase. C190 recognizes the impact and can be used during this time as it sets out specific measures that can be taken. During the negotiations, we gave example after example of instances when work is the safest for those who are experiencing domestic violence. But when home becomes a workplace, people experiencing domestic violence are definitely more at risk. Additionally, they've lost their place of respite, and so safety, that their safety place, which is work, and that's so important. It means that unions and employers have limited opportunities to provide support for folks and to intervene and to interrupt the isolation during domestic violence. This is where social dialogue and collaboration between unions and employers on policies and procedures come in, and all of this is in the recommendations. Education, training, risk assessment, safety planning, and other provisions all suggested in the recommendations of the Convention, Recommendation 206. The issue of third-party violence was also a problem before the pandemic in many sectors, but as many public-facing workers have to enforce physical distancing requirements, mask wearing, and other adjustments to the services that they provide, they're also seeing and bearing the brunt of people's stress, anxiety, and frustrations. So we've heard about nurses going to work on public transportation who are being beaten up, who are being doused with acid, transportation and grocery workers who are also seeing a significantly higher incidences of violence and harassment, all again due to the stress of COVID-19. Both Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 offers us clear guidance that can help both employers and workers to identify the hazards, assess the risks, and take effective measures to protect the health and safety of all workers. For the millions of workers working from home on various forms of communications technology platforms, again, the Director General has spoken about the incidences of cyberbullying. That has also increased. And C190 can also, we can use that to trigger conversations about how to prevent and address cyberbullying and other technologically mediated forms of harassment and violence, which can also be very debilitating. With the lockdowns and most people working from home and on screens, no one could turn away from the violence and harassment that was on full display for everyone to see, forcing the world to witness the vulnerability caused by gender and skin color played out in front of them, but it's played out every single day for racialized people. The very thing that many tried to say during the negotiations didn't exist. So in addition to the pandemic, we're having evolving conversations about racism and discrimination, which are having repercussions in our workplaces, which requires good policies, awareness raising about all forms of discriminatory harassment and violence. So this pandemic has shown us that C190 is much more relevant than ever, and that the need to ratify and implement it is urgent, extremely urgent. The ILO has released an excellent brief, and it lays out these instruments and how these instruments can assist and support all of its constituents during this difficult time. I encourage everyone to read it, and people, everyone on this line, it is time to ratify and implement C190, and I hope we can count on your support to make sure that this happens. Thank you all so much, and happy anniversary again.
Thank you so much, Marie. And thank you for mentioning the brief as well on COVID-19 and Convention 190, its particular relevance in this context. And we'll put up the reference on the chat so that people can access that brief. And also for raising that the convention really foresees that there are groups that will be disproportionately affected by violence and harassment in the world of work. And we're certainly seeing that in the COVID-19 context, as you mentioned. Now I'd like to turn to Ms. Herzog. And again, what role do you believe the convention can play in the context of the COVID-19 response and recovery? Over to you.
Thank you, Shana. And I'll leave it to the organizers to enable my, the host to enable my video, but I'm pleased, oh, here we go. There we are. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. Hi, thank you, Shana, Manuela, Thank you also Director-General Guy Ryder, Ms. Clark Walker. It's an honor to be here representing U.S. Council for International Business and also the International Organization of Employers. It's a wonderful anniversary that we're celebrating today, Violence and Harassment Convention 190 was appropriately landed and adopted on the Centenary anniversary, and it was such an appropriate topic, and we were very proud to be able to participate. It was a historic moment for all of us that were present, and for me, on a personal note, I was representing U.S. employers. It was an honor to be able to cast a vote in favor of Convention 190. As employers, we engage meaningfully throughout the negotiations for Convention 190 because of our core belief that violence and harassment is unacceptable anywhere, and in particular in the workplace. When constituents the last 2 years came together to negotiate this standard, we, of course, had no idea that COVID-19 would be coming. When ILO constituents come together to negotiate a new instrument, they don't do it because of a crisis or a non-crisis. When it comes to any standard at the ILO, employers have always advocated that conventions should be focused, clear, and flexible in order to be able to adapt to the different national circumstances in which we all anticipate that they will be applied through ratification and the varying capacities of the actors involved. And as has been noted, COVID-19 has certainly shown the vulnerability of our governance systems and the varying ability of different states to be able to manage the crisis. But Convention 190 provides an important global framework for us to be able to understand and take action when it comes to violence and harassment in the workplace. We are seeing that, as Director General noted, that the pandemic is giving rise to increased levels of violence, and it's impacting workers. We're seeing it, as has been noted, with frontline workers, grocery store workers who are experiencing third-party violence and harassment. Government officials are experiencing harassment, different groups, different ethnic groups, discrimination and terrible assumptions about people of Asian ethnicity. There's no excuse. Just because we're in a crisis, just because there's a pandemic, it doesn't mean that we should be lowering our standards of civil discourse. But Convention 19 provides us with an important framework to be able to address these increased issues that are taking place in the workplace. All actors in the world of work have a role to play, and the preamble of the convention made that very clear, and that zero tolerance policies for violence and harassment ought to be promoted. The scope of Convention 190 is particularly relevant and helpful because it has a broad scope. It protects the full range of workers, public and private sector workers, informal economy. It covers violence perpetrated by and against third parties. It also clarifies, especially for employers, that the responsibility of employers has to be noted with regards to their degree of control in the situation. And it gives the special gender lens, has been noted. And for COVID, we're seeing that women are particularly impacted. There are a lot of the frontline workers who are carrying out the necessary tasks on behalf of all of us, but also are facing increased exposure to violence and harassment. Importantly, Convention 190 also clarifies that employers are to be protected employers can be targets of violence and harassment, and we're seeing that as well in the crisis. For example, store managers being having unacceptable behaviors directed towards them as well, and so Convention 190 is comprehensive in that regard in terms of protecting everyone. And in the context of COVID-19, that's the discussion for today, but Convention 190 also goes beyond this crisis, and it gives protections for the full range of citizens and employees and employers that would be facing harassment in the workplace based on discrimination. And while LGBT employees or persons are not mentioned in the standard, through national dialogue and discussions on ratification at the national level, countries are going to be able to define violence and harassment in keeping with the standard, but also go beyond, as we did here in the United States this week when our Supreme Court clarified that our civil rights legislation, when it comes to LGBT persons in the workplace, also are protected, and that's the law of the land. And at the national level, we'll be able to consider ratification around the world, but also be able to apply it in a broad way that really gets at the spirit of what we were seeking to do to make sure that no categories of persons would face further discrimination or harassment or violence in the workplace. And that's certainly very important. So while we didn't anticipate COVID, Convention 190 is more relevant than ever. And we join with Director Ryder and Ms. Clark-Walker in calling for increased ratification. Kudos to you, Uruguay. Kudos to you, Fiji. And we look forward to and support more ratifications of Convention 190.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. And I think you've underlined one of the really key concepts in the convention, which is really innovative. Everyone has the right to a world of work free from violence and harassment. Everyone, not just the people we like, not just people on certain contracts, not just citizens, everybody. And I think the whole negotiations really started from that premise, which was fantastic. And it's why we have, I think, the incredibly strong instrument that we have now. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn to Minister Jordan, who is the Minister of Labour and Social Partnership Relations of Barbados, who was our rapporteur for the committee last year in the conference. And he's prepared a short video message for us.
The question speaks to navigating the COVID crisis and how ILO Convention 190 and Recommendation 206 could assist. Now, the crisis occasioned by COVID-19 has many ramifications. It has resulted in a lot of dislocation in economies across the world. It has occasioned mass layoffs, job losses, the closure of businesses. And as countries work to reopen their economies and to get business going and to get people back to work, the labor market is in flux, so that workers, there's no an oversupply of workers. When this happens, it becomes, unfortunately, the kind of situation that allows or facilitates the oppression, the approach to workers that is not always in their best interests. And so what Convention 190 can do to assist is that the convention itself speaks to the matter of violence and harassment in the world of work. So it brings a level of attention to the fact that overtly and subtly in some cases, there is the tendency to violence and certain forms of harassment. So that violence may not be open, may not be overt, but there are those pressures that are brought to bear. And in a climate like the one we are in, it will become more rampant. So first, the convention brings attention to the matter. It brings attention to the fact that there will be certain fears, certain uncertainties on the part of workers. What it does is also bring attention to the fact that in crisis situations, there is a disproportionate impact, a disproportionate negative impact on women workers. And so the convention that we crafted essentially 1 year ago speaks generally to violence and harassment in the world of work, but it also speaks specifically, highlights specifically gender-based violence and harassment. In this pandemic crisis, there is the need to highlight the fact that women are going to be at a greater risk than men in terms of negative impact. So bringing to the fore these matters are, well, as outlined in the convention, really help us to focus in on the realities on the ground so that we can address them. Now, there is also the important inclusion in the convention of the world of work as opposed to the workplace. And in this situation, in this crisis within which we find ourselves, it is important to note that we look beyond the workplace, the physical workspace. We are now in a situation where people are working from home, teleworking, using the technology much more than they did before. And Convention 190 allows us to recognize that instances of violence, harassment, overt or covert or subtle, can take place even outside of the office, the physical workspace. But wherever that worker is involved in work-related activity, those spaces and those places also need to be considered as we look at the impacts that violence and harassment can have on people in this COVID-19 crisis situation.
No, thanks very much to the Minister for sending those video remarks. One of the themes that we're hearing from all the speakers now is how important it is that rights and standards are upheld in times of crisis, that we have to be even more vigilant at these times. And if we remember, of course, the ILO was born out of a time of crisis and a time of devastation. And the standards, so many of them really have stood the test of time and have shown how important it is in these times that we apply them. Now I'd like to move to Mr. Cedrola, who is the advisor of the minister from Uruguay. And since June last year, several countries have embarked on national processes to ratify Convention number 190. And we are absolutely delighted that Uruguay deposited the instrument of ratification last week, thus becoming the first country to officially, formally ratify Convention number 190. And of course, Uruguay was also the first country to ratify the last new convention of the ILO in 2011, which was Convention 189 on domestic workers. So really, your country has been an incredible leader in the ratification process. Could you share with us the experience of your country in this ratification process of Convention 190 and any lessons learned and challenges that you'd like to share in this regard? Thank you, sir. The floor is yours.
Sí, muchas gracias. Buenos días para todos, señor director general de la OIT, señores miembros del panel y así como también a todos los participantes del coloquio. En primer lugar, reciban nuestros saludos desde el Uruguay. Nos es muy grato participar en este evento y nos es muy grato hablar en nombre del Ministerio de Trabajo y a nombre propio también. Como bien se decía, Uruguay ha recientemente ratificado este convenio internacional número 190, y se nos ha preguntado cuáles son las lecciones aprendidas y los retos que este convenio representa. Yo quisiera señalar en relación a esta pregunta que tenemos dos grandes lecciones aprendidas y un gran reto hacia el futuro. La primera lección aprendida tiene que ver con el propio proceso de ratificación del convenio. Este proceso involucró dos administraciones gubernamentales distintas. Como es sabido, en diciembre del 2019 comenzó el proceso bajo la administración del país por parte del presidente Vázquez y del ministro de Trabajo Ernesto Murro, y ese proceso culminó bajo una administración distinta, a cargo del presidente Lacalle Pou y del ministro Mieres. Claramente esto lo que nos deja como experiencia y como enseñanza es la importancia de mantener políticas más allá de las distintas diferencias que puedan existir entre los gobiernos de turno. El país ha tenido históricamente una política de ratificación de los convenios de la OIT, de mantenimiento de ciertas bases sociales que han ido mucho más allá de los distintos gobiernos que van pasando en los distintos años. Con lo cual, un reconocimiento para la administración anterior y un reconocimiento también para esta administración que ha sabido continuar el camino en cuestiones que resultan esenciales, como el tripartismo y el respeto a la ratificación de las normas internacionales. Es una cuestión que puede parecer meramente de forma, pero es una cuestión que entiendo hace a la singularidad de un país como Uruguay, que ha sido históricamente un país de respeto de las normas internacionales y de respeto de los principios del tripartismo. La segunda lección aprendida, en mi opinión, tiene que ver con el contenido sustantivo del Convenio Internacional 190. Más concretamente, si lo comparamos en relación con las normas actualmente vigentes en nuestro país. En Uruguay, nosotros teníamos, anteriormente a la ratificación de este instrumento internacional, dos leyes relacionadas con la violencia en el trabajo. La ley de acoso sexual, número 18.561, y la ley de violencia contra la mujer, 19.580. Esta confrontación nos permite ver que el ámbito de aplicación y que el contenido de nuestra legislación en relación con el convenio se ve ampliado. El convenio tiene un ámbito y una serie de definiciones muy interesantes que de alguna manera amplían nuestra propia legislación. Esta conclusión se puede simplemente extraer apreciando, por ejemplo, el alcance que da el convenio no solamente a los trabajadores, sino también a los empleadores, y dentro del ámbito de los trabajadores, sin importar el tipo de contrato, la vinculación o modalidad que sus trabajadores tengan. También se puede apreciar al ver la definición del lugar de trabajo, cómo se extiende y se amplía a situaciones también de viajes, desplazamientos dentro de la empresa. De la misma manera, la podemos apreciar al contemplar no solamente lo que tiene que ver con el compromiso de buscar políticas tendientes a evitar toda forma de violencia y de acoso, sino también a mitigar los riesgos psicosociales asociados a la gestión de la seguridad y la salud en el trabajo. Situación que es muy importante, no solamente la prevención, sino en caso de que se generen estas circunstancias, la situación vinculada a mitigar estos riesgos psicosociales. Y por último, lo que tiene que ver con mecanismos eficientes de reparación para quienes puedan haber sufrido alguna circunstancia de este tipo. En consecuencia, segunda gran lección aprendida en relación al contenido de este instrumento internacional, un contenido que es bastante más amplio y que de alguna manera nos interpela en poder trabajar en una adecuación de nuestra legislación. Y eso es de alguna manera nuestro reto de futuro. El principal desafío que tenemos es continuar en esta línea de trabajo, tratando de adaptar la legislación que ya teníamos y que he mencionado, en línea con estos conceptos quizás con una vocación un poco más amplia que se desprenden del texto del propio convenio 190. Y todo eso con la voluntad clara y el compromiso de respetar y promover el disfrute del derecho de toda persona a un mundo de trabajo libre de toda violencia y acoso. ¿Por qué? Porque, en definitiva, toda violencia es censurable, toda violencia es mala, no importa su origen, ni las modalidades que asuma, ni las finalidades que se pretendan encubrir detrás de ella. La violencia siempre es violencia y como tal es censurable y debe ser especialmente reprimible, censurable en el mundo del trabajo. Por todo esto entendemos que tenemos la oportunidad histórica como país de continuar un rumbo que el país ha históricamente mantenido en el seguimiento y en la aceptación de las normas internacionales del trabajo, pero además coadyuvando y colaborando a cumplimentar los objetivos de la OIT, ya sea ratificando, como hemos hecho, el Convenio Internacional 190, o adoptando algunos criterios de la recomendación, ¿sí?, tratando de esa forma de colaborar en la creación de un ambiente de trabajo más libre, más justo, más eficiente y efectivamente erradicando de una vez por todas cualquier tipo de violencia y de acoso en el mismo. Muchas gracias por su atención.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cedrola. Really appreciate the comments and looking at the lessons learned and focusing also in not just the scope of those who are covered in the convention, but also where they're covered. And others have mentioned that as well. That again makes the convention so unique. It's not just in the physical workplace. We know the world of work is much more dynamic now, and it really takes that into account. And thank you again for leading the way in the ratification of Convention 190. Now I'd like to turn to Ms. Ehrenstein-Toivo. Are you with us here? We'll get you on screen shortly. Despite the current COVID-19 situation, your country, Namibia, is well advanced towards the ratification of Convention number 190. Can you tell us more about where this process now stands and what motivated your country to engage in the process? And also, if there's any particular insights that you'd like to share with us and other countries who are considering embarking on this process. Thank you.
Thank you. It's good to be with all of you again. We have very good news. 2 days ago, our cabinet approved the submission to submit the Convention 190 to Parliament for ratification. And also, coincidentally, Convention 189. Now, this came in a path that I'll share with you. It may be relevant to some other countries. When we came back from the International Labor Conference, we first gathered the social partners, the people who had actually participated in the debate in Geneva. We went through the convention and the recommendation, and we agreed that we wanted to work for its ratification. In our ministry, we created a working group on violence and harassment, which considered the implications of the convention for the work of each component of the ministry, such as labor inspection, occupational safety and health, research, dispute resolution, employment equity, etc. And we charted a time schedule for each step on the way to ratification. We organized what we called a high-level consultation of about 200 people, where representing many agencies, ministries, and institutions. We unpacked the convention and asked some of them to make presentations on the current practices that they have, policies and sectoral mechanisms already in place that address violence and harassment. That meeting, like all of the previous ones, supported ratification. And Then ratification was submitted, the convention was submitted to the Tripartite Labor Advisory Council. They recommended ratification. So now it has to go through one small step before it will go to Parliament, but we are confident that we will achieve ratification in the near future. In addition, we are currently having an overall review of our Labor Act, and already the task force that is working on the Labor Act has accepted proposals that will effectuate obligations under the convention, both from the human rights perspective and occupational safety and health. This includes a fundamental right to be free from violence and harassment, and a requirement that every employer have a workplace policy on violence and harassment. What moved us to engage in this process? Well, the international debate that was taking place, the other events happening in the world, and the situation on the ground in Namibia. Like so many other countries, we have a serious problem with gender-based violence, including the impact of domestic violence on the workplace. The vestiges of apartheid manifest themselves in the workplace in violence and harassment. Some of our sectors, such as the healthcare system, the schools, the uniformed services, had specific issues dealing with violence and harassment. And one of the largest employers in the country was rocked by a scandal when its CEO was accused by quite a few of the female employees of engaging in a pattern of violence, of racist, not violence, harassment, sexual harassment at work. In addition, the overall labor relations situation, where in some sectors there's really a lack of respect, not good labor relations. This also was a motivation to embrace the convention. The convention presented the impetus to embark upon a long and multifaceted journey to produce a paradigm of mutual respect in the world of work, both between employers and employees and in relation to third parties. Now, just a few insights lessons we've learned. It is important to brief the broadest possible array of stakeholders, not just unions and employers in their organizations, but any institution that might have any relevance. This might be relevant too. We started the implementation process before ratification. And as we planned for implementation from day one, we said, what can we do? What can we publicize? What measures can we introduce, even as we are working towards ratification? Every step of the process should include public awareness raising. And based upon the broad reach of the convention, the multifaceted character of violence and harassment, and the realization that it will require a long process to successfully implement the convention and recommendation, we are of the opinion that a multi-stakeholder structure or task force will be required for an ongoing coordination and implementation of the convention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicki, and thank you for that great news about Cabinet approving the submission of not only Convention 190, but also Convention 189 to go to Parliament with a proposal for ratification. So that's really fantastic news. And also the process that you went through, which was such a consultative one, and I think that really shows that this is, as we've heard from other speakers, it's an issue that brings people together. It brings workers and employers together. It brings different stakeholders together. It goes across party lines. And you've really brought all the stakeholders together to make sure that in the implementation, they would all have a voice and ownership in that. So I think it's a process to be, to inspire others. Can somebody let me know if you can hear me now? Great, thank you. Okay. Did you hear about the poll that we've just launched? Yes, okay. No, all right. There is going to be a poll that's going to come up. You're free to put your responses in at any time between now and just before we close the event. And those should come up for you. Now I'm going to turn back to Gabriela Herzog. During the COVID-19 crisis, employers have been very active on many fronts, including with respect to measures to prevent and address violence and harassment. Could you share examples of good practices that have emerged during the crisis? Gabriela, I can see you there. Let's see if we can get your video on too. Gabriela, go ahead. I think we should be able to hear you even if we can't see you right now. Oh, there you are. Thanks.
Hello. Thanks again. Yes, there have been a number of good practices in place during the crisis. Of course, employers have a key role in creating safe workplaces. And even though the COVID pandemic has presented many new risks for businesses and enterprises, especially small and medium enterprises, it also serves as a time to look forward and adopt strategies effective strategies to reduce harassment and prevent assault during the pandemic and over the long term. As I mentioned, the resources and capacities of employers, certainly because of COVID, have been reduced, but it doesn't mean that employers are becoming complacent regarding health and safety of their employees. If anything, the COVID crisis has shown us that occupational health and safety is paramount to a productive and well-functioning private sector, but also economy. And a key component of health and safety is the absence of any types of violence and harassment. And so employers will continue to demonstrate their responsibilities by understanding and establishing conducive workplace cultures, clarifying with policies and awareness raising about expectations of workplace behavior and the unacceptableness of violence and harassment in the workplace, building dialogue and trust with employees to be able to bring complaints, having clear mechanisms in place for raising concerns and investigating and addressing those concerns in the workplace. ILO and governments have a key role to play here as well. In particular, they should provide employers and especially small and medium enterprises, again, with practical tools and approaches that are effective so that they can address violence and harassment meaningfully, but without undue pressure or bureaucracy. Clear guidance and tools to support, especially, as I say, all sizes and sectors of employment. And even though we're not able to, at this point, predict the full impact of the COVID pandemic, employers are critically positioned to be able to lead in building back better to promote equality and progress towards long-term solutions to workplace violence and harassment. One thing I'd like to mention, it's been mentioned, domestic violence, which is included in the convention. And on the topic of best practices, UN Secretary-General Gutierrez noted with concern, as Director Ryder did earlier, the increase that we're seeing of domestic violence cases. And he noted with concern the strain on services for victims of domestic violence. And he called directly upon governments to double their efforts to make sure that those types of systems and services are in place for victims of domestic violence. It was an important discussion and an important issue during the negotiation, and the challenges that were recognized that domestic violence takes place in homes away from the workplace, but good practices, including calls for governments to make sure to have the services available for victims, and then employers to be able to become aware of those services and resources and bring those to the attention of employees and direct them to those services that are available to them as well are also good practices.
Thank you so much, Gabriela. And you've also given us some pointers too for where the ILO should be going on some of these issues. So thank you for that. Now I turn to Rose Omamo. Rose, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. For the past year, workers have been very active in promoting the ratification of Convention number 190, and certainly very active in the whole process of the adoption as well. Can you tell us more about the campaigns and effective action that workers have been engaged in? And what are the plans moving forward to support a new and what we'd like to see as a better normal without violence and harassment in the world of work? The floor is yours, Rose. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving me the floor. I want to join the other speakers in wishing everybody a happy anniversary and to say that I'm so humbled to be here today to also contribute to this discussion. Let me start by saying that trade unions worldwide have been engaged in various campaigns towards ratification of Convention 190 and Recommendation 260. A more integrated and interactive approaches have been adopted where videos with gender-sensitive information are shared, banners, social media campaigns through formal groups, and alliances are conducted to end violence and harassment at workplace and in the world of work. Most importantly, enhancing advocacy and lobbying the government to ratify Convention 190 has been key priority action for trade unions. Collaboration and partnership with the other supportive non-governmental organizations in awareness campaigns has also been done, and other plans are in process. Workers' representatives have engaged in sensitizing the society, particularly in global campaigns. For example, this year on the International Women's Day celebrated on 8th March 2020, Convention 190 was the main agenda, and women all over were calling for ratification of this convention. Workers' representatives at the shop floor levels are also ensuring that health and safety policies are adhered to. In addition, workers' representatives in various regions have lobbied for inclusion of Convention 190 as a clause in the collective bargaining agreement, borrowing some items from Recommendation 260 and making sure that they have a clause in their collective bargaining agreement that does not allow violence and harassment at the workplace. Mainstreaming of ILO Convention 190 in workers' education program activities and events have been done. For example, a workers' training program implemented by Frederick Ebert Stiftung that supports workers' education has integrated Convention 190 in their training curriculum. This program empowers young trade unions, leaders, and forms a very good entry point for lobbying and advocacy for ratification of Convention 190. Some trade unions have also formed gender-based violence and harassment committees in their workplaces, which works hand in hand with the occupational safety and health committees in workplaces to make sure that gender-based violence and harassment is not part of the job in their workplaces. Trade unions representatives have also been putting pressure to ensure that all workplaces have sexual harassment policies so that female and male employees may not experience sexual harassment at the place of work. So some of the plans in moving forward to support a new normal without violence and harassment are very necessary, and we are putting in place gender-based violence because gender-based violence has risen in many countries under this period of COVID-19 pandemic. In Kenya, for example, where I come, gender-based violence has risen by 45%. The rise in gender-based violence under COVID-19 has prompted upscaling of the campaigns from community level by carrying out sensitization differently. And so what are we encouraging? We encourage where most unions adapt new media platforms such as virtual and campaigns online, encouraging information sharing and provision of 24-hour service, both hotlines. We encourage that because we feel that if there are online campaigns and there is a 24-hour service hotline, then the victims of gender-based violence would come up and report such cases and share on media platforms. Also, support systems such as counseling centers have to be put in place. This is because the victims need to be counseled and they need centers where they can go and be counseled during this period. Workers must be part of creating solutions towards ending gender-based violence and harassment in the world of work by creating space to end the unacceptable behaviors and culture of silence, to create a change in the workplace and to have a workplace that is free from gender-based violence and harassment. Taking consultative integrational approaches is key in this area. Working with the young people and ensuring that they are involved in policy dialogues have been of key priority. There is need to involve the young workers to bringing back the workplace environment we want. Let me end by saying that there are unions that have signed memorandum of understandings between employers, governments, and themselves to help forge a flexible work arrangement that will ensure that workers' rights are protected. The agreements also advocate for retention of workers, including measures to prevent COVID-19 infections at the workplaces and to make sure that such policies are adhered to. Finally, I want to call for ratification of Convention 190 because it is the only way that we will support a new normal without violence and harassment in the place of work and at the workplaces. I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Omamo, and thank you for that call to action too. You made the point very much about the need for this multifaceted approach. We need to handle this, deal with this issue at many levels. And really at the core of the convention is the obligation to adopt an inclusive, integrated, and gender responsive approach to prevent and eliminate violence and harassment in the world of work. And that sounds really very much the approach that's being taken by the workers and other partners to address these issues. Now I'm going to go back to Mr. Cedrola. The ratification of Convention 190 is an enormous step, but we know that the process doesn't end there. Can you tell us a bit more about the next steps that Uruguay is taking towards the effective implementation of Convention number 190? The floor is yours.
Muchas gracias. Como decíamos hoy, el principal reto es analizar la normativa que yo mencioné que actualmente el país ya tiene, como dije en su momento, una ley sobre acoso sexual y una ley sobre violencia en contra de la mujer. Y en la confrontación con el texto del convenio, tratar de realizar una integración de estas normas, en el sentido que marcábamos hoy. El convenio tiene un ámbito de aplicación y una serie de conceptos que son bastante más amplios que lo que tiene nuestra legislación. Ahí hay un camino de trabajo que posibilitará que en algún momento tengamos algún proyecto como para compartir con la visión de los actores sociales, y en función de eso poder avanzar en la presentación de algún proyecto en el Parlamento. Pero ahí hay un camino que me parece que es gradual, que va a tener su tiempo, pero que es perfectamente transitable con estas características que vengo estipulando. la confrontación de la norma interna con el convenio, la creación de un proyecto y las eventuales consultas que en función de ese primer articulado, de ese primer proyecto, podamos llegar a tener y a compartir con los representantes de los actores sociales. Gracias.
Thank you so much for sharing with us those very concrete next steps. Now I'd like to turn to Ms. Ernestine Yatoivo. Following the COVID-19 outbreak, we have heard a lot of news stories about the increased incidence of racism and xenophobia, very much linked to the world of work, and some of the other speakers have mentioned some specific examples. The economic crisis that the COVID-19 outbreak has provoked has also exacerbated social tensions, including in the world of work. Could you please tell us how, in your view, the ILO Convention number 190 could be key in addressing such a phenomenon and contribute to fairer economic growth, including by leveraging social and cultural change? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to talk about Namibia. As I mentioned before, Namibia has a history of apartheid. So the vestiges of apartheid remain. We also have a significant problem with tribalism. And these problems are reflected in the world of work. Now, overall, the COVID-19 has magnified the problems that we have in our country, including in the world of work, and has held them up for scrutiny. They're literally in your face. This creates an opportunity because since they have been magnified, since everyone can see them and they can see the problems, it gives us an opportunity to maybe address them more boldly. Now, during especially during the lockdown, there were various really overtly racist behavior on the part of employers that were trending on social media. In one case, ostensibly a white farmer was advising farmers when they who have sent their workers home, when they call them back, to only call back the white workers. They said, you have fewer problems, you can just eliminate black workers completely. There was a video that's in the last week of the owner of the largest security company in Namibia who was screaming at a security guard, it's not just screaming, but really in the most obscene way, also making obscene comments about freedom. It was horrifying. And a white teacher, for reasons best known for her, she had this very racist soliloquy on social media. And the public demanded that something be done about her. It wasn't just that she should be prosecuted under our laws against racial discrimination. She was fired by her employer. Employers said they don't go along with this kind of behavior. Now, as a result of COVID-19, there in our country is a growing realization among the public about the centrality of employment and of social dialogue to the well-being of the society. And therefore, and I mean, that may sound strange, but often in the economic sphere, employment isn't really paid attention to. This jobless growth and so forth. Now, we see the convention, as others have said, as a tool. There's an opening, people know there's something wrong. The other day, there was a demonstration, a silent protest in the center of Windhoek, organized by young people that took place at 4 locations so that they could observe social distancing. And they linked the issues of gender-based violence and racism. And if you listen to the speakers, quite few of them were talking about these problems as they manifest themselves at work. So there's a new awareness, as I said, a new opening, and this is a very, very good tool. We are fortunate that we're about to ratify, but also we now have an opportunity to look at some of our existing institutions, such as the Employment Equity Commission, and see how we can retool it so that it can become the place where someone who wants to make a safe place to complain about violence and harassment or harassment, to get counseling. We can not say we don't need necessarily to create new institutions. The ones that we have can be enhanced or expanded to take advantage of the opportunity presented now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Vicky. And you brought out a number of really important points there. And I think the fact that crises can open up opportunities for us as well, and that violence and harassment's always been there, but it can't be ignored anymore. And I really liked what you said about it gives us the opportunity to address it more boldly. So now we've got an opening and we can't lose that opportunity. So thank you for those reflections. Now, Director General, you get the last question on the panel. I have to find the last question. Now I have it. There it is. How can the ILO support constituents in advancing towards a better normal, free from violence and harassment? And what is the ILO doing internally to be able to lead by example?
Well, thank you, Shauna. But I think the discussion that we've all heard today is the best possible reminder to the ILO of its responsibilities to firstly help our member states to ratify and then apply Convention 190. Now, we've heard some great and encouraging news, not just from Uruguay, of course, but from Fiji and from Namibia. And where they have led us, we want our other member states to follow. So a big job for us is to work with our national constituents, our member states, to look at whatever issues are on the table in moving towards ratification. That might be technical examination of existing law and practice, see what has to be done at national level to come into full conformity with the convention. We've heard a great example from Namibia of how that process worked in that country. And that's not where it finishes, of course, because ratification is one thing, but application is the next. And as our colleague from Uruguay has said, there is a lot of work to be done post-ratification as well. So this is really, I think, at the core of the ILO's responsibilities, and will be for some time as we want to move ratifications forward. You know, it's not always the case, but having heard of ratifications already recorded in the Americas, one coming from the Asia-Pacific region and one announced from Africa, I think we have to get behind our European member states to make sure they're not left behind in this process. Our current circumstances as well, as countries will be preparing recovery programs from COVID-19, for all the reasons that colleagues have spoken to about the spiking of abusive behavior, I think there is space to try to find within these recovery plans a real concerted attention to be given to issues of violence and harassment. And in that sense, that provides opportunity to promote ratification. So that's one side of my answer. The other side is a slightly more introspective response. You know, it is absolutely vital for all sorts of reasons that the ILO lead by example. And that means that our own workplaces, our own offices, our events as well, so that implies our constituents as well, all of these have to be free from any manifestation or threat of violence and harassment. And none of this stuff should be taken for granted. So we are subjecting all of our internal human resource rules and regulations and processes to review with this objective in mind. We're working to raise staff awareness of all of the issues that you can find in Convention 190. We want to make sure not only that they know about the remedies that are available to them, to ILO staff, but also to have confidence in them. And this is perhaps the most important thing of all. And sort of to bundle all of this together, Shauna, we're launching, and it's today that we're doing it to mark the anniversary, our own campaign. We're calling it ILO Respect, making ILO offices a space of respect for everyone always. And with this campaign, we hope to make sure that we are doing exactly as I've said, leading by example in this extraordinarily important endeavor that we have to make all of the ambitions and all of the provisions of Convention 190 a reality for all workers. And listening to colleagues today has been, including colleagues who have been so important in the adoption of Convention 190 and now its promotion. It underlines the importance of these responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Director General. And thanks to all of you who submitted questions and comments. We're certainly going to collect and review them and group them. And what we'd like to do is put the questions and the groups of questions and the responses on the website next week. We have received so many of them, and we don't want to miss any. We also, coming out of our second poll, have a lot of information about what's happening in different countries. And we can see that there are things going on in almost 40% of the countries where people are represented today, which is great. So we'll put some more of that information also on the website next week. And let me just thank the panelists who all played really important roles in the shaping of the instruments. And I'd like to thank them for their ongoing commitment to Convention 190 and for ending violence and harassment, but also the very concrete work that they're doing to really end violence and harassment in the world of work. And with that, I turn the floor back to Manuela for some concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shauna. We have really had an extremely rich and insightful conversation, and I would really like to thank all the panelists for their commitment, for their vision, for their passion, for the action already taken, and more action that needs to come. I would just like to highlight a couple of takeaways from this debate. First, I think that there is a consensus that the Convention 190 is an instrument for all seasons. It is relevant both in time of prosperity and in time of economic crisis. And as the DG highlighted, it's really a key condition to build back better and for human-centered development. All of the speakers also highlighted the practical usefulness of the guidance which is provided by Convention 190. Because indeed, because of its very broad scope, not only in terms of who is covered, but also the instances that are covered, is indeed capable of addressing the very specific challenges that the world of work is facing today in the context, in the context of the current pandemic. And many of you have also underlined the value added of this convention, which is indeed bringing together the human rights world with its emphasis on non-discrimination and equality, as well as the world of occupational safety and health. And this is really an extremely and effective approach towards addressing the causes and the symptoms of violence and harassment at work. The second main message that emerged from the discussion, I think, is that the pandemic should not be used as a pretext for inaction. That we should not accept that violence and harassment at work becomes the new normal. And you have explained why. You have referred to the disastrous effects that this would have in terms of human suffering, but also for the economy and for the sustainability of businesses. You have all alluded to the fact that if violence and harassment would be left unchecked, this would widen and worsen even further pre-existing problems of gender-based violence, as well as tensions and divisions along ethnic lines as those that we are witnessing these days. And I think that the ratification of the convention and the genuine desire to indeed implement it, I think this emerged very clearly from the words of the representative from Uruguay, is indeed a testimony to the recognition that the convention is indeed a central piece of the response to COVID-19 and the recovery process. And as I think also Shona highlighted earlier on, this is a convention which is truly bipartisan, because indeed brings everybody along around the table. Another important message deals with the fact that everybody has a role to play in making a world of work free from violence and harassment a reality. It's not only governments. You have all referred to the importance of consultation, of social dialogue, including collective bargaining, in order to shaping policies and strategies that are better informed and better tailored to the different specific circumstances of countries and also enterprises, and bearing also into account the specific needs and constraints that small enterprises face. The DG raised another very important point, which is that it is not only laws and policies that will make the trick. Organizations, whether public or private, need also to change and bring their homes into order. And I think that indeed the very thorough review which is being undertaken in the ILO with regard to our internal procedures and rules with a view to ensuring that indeed violence and harassment does not exist any longer in the ILO is a very important confirmation of that. I know that I have no longer time at disposal. Therefore, I would like to conclude this, my short remarks, with the hope that more ratifications will follow, because ratifications convey a very important political signal with very practical implications. However, the fact that certain countries may not yet be ripe to ratify because they need more time should not prevent them from taking action to prevent and address violence and harassment in the world of work. And the office definitely stand ready to assist them as needed. I would like to end here, and of course, thanking again all the panelists for their very insightful contributions. We really count very much on you to keep flagging the cause of the fight against violence and harassment. I would like to also thank the interpreters that have been accompanying us and have allowed us to engage in this very important exchange. I would like also to thank all my colleagues in the ILO that have worked extremely hard in order to put together this webinar. And last but not least, of course, thank the Director-General that has been accompanying us until now. So thank you very much, and the journey is just starting. Thank you. Bye.